Hey folks, it's James. I'm here with the cast of the Rubber Boots podcast. Puffy, Stoff, and Lester. Say hello, guys.
Hey, what's up?
Yep.
Oh,
Rubber Beauties, Rubber Beauties, they're true to themselves. Rubber Beauties, Rubber Beauties, they're true. It's true, it's true, it's true. Rubber Beauties, Rubber Beauties, they're true. They're true to themselves.
That is Lester McLean with the theme to the Rubber Beauties podcast, episode 1. That was the first time I'd ever heard that theme song. Well done, Lester.
Thank you.
I should say right off the top, Rubber Beauties, the name will make sense in a second for anyone who has never listened to the Rubber Boots podcast. This is going to be the Beauties After Pod. You guys are familiar. You're familiar with the after shows. Walking Dead has an after show.
Yeah.
And Puffy didn't I think actually Dan Levy, who is now a big megastar after Schitt's Creek, he came to fame by hosting the Hills after show.
Hills after show, yeah.
Which I know Puffy was a big fan of the Hills, weren't you, Puffy?
Huge fan. I love the Hills.
They never get them now.
Lauren
was the main girl. Kristen Cavalieri was on there, I think.
Right. Branched off into her own show.
Yeah.
I should introduce everybody. If you have not listened to the Rubber Boots podcast, my name's James Duthie. You heard my voice on Beauties, if you came over here for that. Puffy was the gentleman I was just speaking to. Puffy's a producer at TSN and a good buddy of mine. Lester McLean, who did the theme for the Beauties podcast, the Rubber Beauties podcast, and basically any theme that I've ever requested in my history at TSN, done by Lester McLean.
That's me.
And the Rubber Beauties Beauties After Pod is the brilliant idea of our producer, Christoph Momona, also star of the Rubber Boots podcast. Well done.
Stuff.
Thank you.
I have an ad read to do off the top before we get into it. Rubber Beauties is brought to you by the Rubber Boots podcast. Follow 4 friends as they navigate through the world of sports media. Each week a new wacky adventure emerges. So strap on your rubber boots and join the journey. The Rubber Boots podcast, available wherever you find your podcasts. So
I hear they're good.
It's a breezy listen.
They must
Great
be
show.
doing well to be able to afford the big sponsorship dollars for Rubber Beauties podcast.
Must be.
Absolutely.
If the listeners listen to the Rubber Boots podcast, is it now sponsored by the Rubber Beauties podcast?
It may very well be.
It's all getting very hard to keep track of at this point.
Everything goes hand in hand, James.
Amazingly, both podcasts are losing money on this deal.
Can we put on our resumes now that we now have 3 podcasts on the go?
Absolutely.
Well,
For
not
sure.
Puffy. You're not a part of Beauties. Only
Well, I have
Lester.
two.
Stuff.
I have 2.
You do have multiple podcasts. You're a multiple podcaster. Basically, Stoff's idea in doing this is that the Beauties podcast has all these great hockey stories, and we wanted to give you a little bit behind the scenes of what went into that particular episode. I have a lot of stuff that didn't get in. Stoff is going to provide some bonus content, some of the interview clips that didn't make it into the podcast. And then you, Puffy and Lester, you can play your roles as the average guy. Puffy plays it perfectly in life. And
I don't.
ask
Yes.
questions. You're not look at you, Lester. You're not average.
I think that's a compliment.
No, I shouldn't say average, Puffy. You're not average. I just mean you're a man of the people.
That's better. That's
Fair?
the best way of putting it.
So our first episode of Beauties, we're very excited about this, was Darryl. And I know you guys have listened to it. It was basically about Sidney Crosby's days in junior with the Rimouski Oceanique and his wacky roommate and best buddy, Eric Nielsen, who remains one of his best friends to this day. Stuff I wanted to quickly tell you before you ask me stuff. it was fascinating putting together this book. First of all, it was Jon Cooper that put me on to Eric Nielsen. I said to Jon Cooper at the end of the interview, by the way, Jon Cooper's story will be featured, I think, in next week's episode of Beauties.
Absolutely.
Is that correct, Scott? One of the best stories in the book, I think, as well. Also a story from Steven Stamkos in there. But Jon Cooper, coach of the Stanley Cup champion Tampa Bay Lightning, I said at the end of our interview, is there anybody else you know, like who are the greatest characters you've ever coached? And right away he said, Eric Nielsen. You have to talk to Eric Nielsen. Eric Nielsen never made it to the National Hockey League, as you heard in the Beauties podcast. He just played junior and then played his way around the minors. But Cooper said he was one of the craziest, most fun guys he had ever coached. And the story at the end of the pod where he impersonates the drug dealer for Halloween and then gets arrested, I believe Cooper was perhaps the coach then in Norfolk, or maybe he'd moved on already. But anyway, that's how we got Eric Nielsen in the book. I'm very glad that he did. Sidney Crosby, obviously, when I sat down to do this book, and we did not know we were going to do the podcast at that point, I wanted the biggest names in the game. I wanted Crosby and McDavid and Gretzky and Orr, and they're all in there. But it's hard to get these guys and get the time. And so I went through a process to get a hold of Sid and finally did. But the way Sid did it was very different than everybody else. Sid would send me voice memos. You can actually, the one clip that you heard off the top of the Beauties pod was actually in an interview. I sat down and did an interview with him for the anniversary of the 2010 Olympics. And so I did get a little bit with him afterwards. But before then, for a period of about 3 months, every week or so, I would get a voice memo, and it would just be Sid telling me another story. Hey,
that's pretty cool.
Yeah, I don't know if he just didn't want to talk to me or what. No, he would just do it on the road between games or whatever, and he'd be like, hey, I thought of another one. And he'd tell me a story about Eric Nielsen, and then he told me a story about Colby Armstrong, which ends up in the book. And it was just the weirdest thing that on my phone every week or two, this little voice memo would pop up from Sid, who God knows where he was. He'd be like, hey, James, here's another story. And so that's the way maybe that's the way Sid communicates with everybody, voice memo folders. Imagine if Sid's having a relationship that way.
It's kind of romantic.
Maybe he is, James.
Hey, honey, Sid again. Just wanted to tell you, see you later on tonight. Maybe I should start communicating with Brooksy that way, only through voice memos.
Do you think Brooksy would like that? She likes to have the close connection.
She does. Brooksy's my wife, by the way, for anyone who has not listened to the Rubber Boots podcast.
I guess that's what I'm saying, Brooksy. You get that through your head?
What did you guys think? Anything you want to know after listening to Darryl?
Was Darryl on that team? Not Darryl. Was Eric Nielsen on that team that won all the games with Cooper? They won 30 in a row, that Norfolk team, I remember.
And
Cooper was the coach.
I probably should know the answer to as the author of the book.
I don't mean to stump you. Just more out of curiosity if it came out.
No, that's okay. That's what this podcast is for. Maybe we'll get an answer next week. Sof, can you Google what year the Norfolk Admirals won the Calder, won 28 games in a row? It's actually in the book, but I never actually paralleled it because he didn't talk about that story, because the chapter was about Sid. I never asked him. But right. Nielsen was kind of a tough guy, but just a good, one of those great character players.
So it's 2011, 2012.
2011, 2012 that they did that?
That they did that. I'm just looking up to see when he would have been.
I don't want this podcast to be just us trying to figure out facts.
No, of course not.
Us Googling.
What I was going to say is that I don't know if I have so much question, is that a comment, and that is, for as long as I've heard about Sid, it's always this whole, I've always been told that he eats and sleeps and breathes hockey, and, he's a very quiet guy and he doesn't do much. So to be able to know that he has all these stories and he's I think it's fascinating to know that he's not just, Mr. Hockey, like a machine in that regard, No,
he's a good lad, and the fact that he embraced this book, and the story about Colby Armstrong is really great in the book as well. I should tell people as well. I had a few people comment to me when we announced that we were releasing the book in the podcast that, okay, well, why am I going to buy the book if you're going to do the podcast? We're only going to share probably 10 to 15% of the stories in the book in the podcast. And I don't know how long a season we'll do, maybe just up to Christmas. We'll see how it goes and if people want more stories. We have some stories that didn't make it into the book that we're going to use in the podcast. But there'll also be a handful of chapters from the book that we use in the podcast as well. Puffy, if you don't listen to the Rubber Boots podcast, Puffy does something called Puffy's Hypotheticals, where he asks us questions. Were you going to ask us something from the book? Yeah, the chapter.
Oh yeah, I had a hypothetical. Give me 1 second.
Puffy's now looking up his hypothetical on his phone.
Stop wrote it out really nicely.
While he's looking that up, I will confirm that both Eric Nielsen and Jon Cooper were on that team.
See?
Look at that.
There you go.
That was also Eric Nielsen's only year in Norfolk, so that would have been the Halloween party, which means Jon Cooper would have been there for that as well.
So basically, if you have awesome team parties and get-togethers, you're going to roll off big-time winning streaks. So the teams that party together, they win together.
That's a fair conclusion, Puffy.
That's a very fair conclusion.
Did you find your hypothetical that Stoff came up for you, Puffy? Now that you have
I came up with it. He just wrote it down for me.
Okay.
Okay. If you could have been a mentor for any superstar athlete or actor at the beginning of their career, who would it be?
Ooh.
Oh, as Eric Nielsen was for Sidney Crosby.
Yes.
I think I would have acted as a mentor for which supermodel should I choose? Maybe I'll get her before Lester does. Halle Berry.
Nah.
I think I could have guided
I have an answer quite quickly, actually, and I swear to you, I did not hear this question before.
Yeah.
My answer to that question is based on history, and it's going to sound Toronto-centric, but I'm going to go with Vince Carter. And the reason I say Vince Carter is because I really think that, I mean, he said that I don't know if he's come out and said that he's regretted leaving Toronto, but I really think that if he and Tracy McGrady had stayed, we would have had a championship in Toronto much sooner. And I think his legacy overall would have been greater. And I don't mean in a sense that doesn't have a great legacy, because he does. No question about it. But I just think that if he had, thought a little further ahead about the big picture of his legacy, to be the first guy to bring a championship to Toronto, the first major star to bring a basketball championship to Toronto. Don't go to your graduation. Stay, and let's build this. And then once you win the championship, you can do whatever you want.
Well
That's
done.
what I think. That is my answer.
I think I would have mentored Bob McKenzie, because then his life and career wouldn't have gone just so askew. He could have been something, and instead he went down a wrong path.
You would have said, Bobby, don't go into TV. It will never work out for you.
Oh, yes.
Stay in the print role.
Christoph, did you have an answer to that hypothetical?
Yeah, I would have mentored Puffy. Because we all know Puffy had a little trouble focusing earlier in life. And I'm thinking, because you guys said actors, that if I mentored Puffy to focus a little bit more, he wouldn't have been cut from Kodachrome.
It's true. I wouldn't have been on the cutting room floor in many a production.
This is an episode. Is this an episode of A-hole or A-OK? Because I feel like an A-hole. I gave a serious answer, and you guys are, you know what I mean?
Well,
we call you Serious Lester for a reason.
He's Serious Lester.
My serious answer would be Leonardo DiCaprio right after Titanic came out.
Oh my God.
The hypothetical I wanted to ask was, one of the stories you guys heard in the podcast was that Eric got in trouble after crashing his car and made a deal with the police officer that he would be let go and not charged with careless driving if he got Sidney Crosby to sign a couple of cards and give them to the police officer. And, of course, he came home. Crosby did it in his sleep, got pen all over his face, and so on and so forth. If Puffy came to your or my house at 2 a.m. and said, I'm in big trouble with the cops, all you got to do is sign 2 guitar picks, or maybe I sign 2 copies of Beauties, and we can get out of it. but would you agree to do so? Knowing the world we live in now, the story could come out later.
In a book.
Yeah.
Would I do it? Sure, I'd do it.
Of course you'd do it.
Of course to help him out. You know, now it's not my fault he killed 2 guys. I don't know. He just says I'm in trouble. Help me out. That's it. If he killed 2 people, I don't know. I could always plead ignorance of the law.
I couldn't do it.
I feel I'd still go to jail. But
What do
still,
you couldn't?
I can't do it. It's too much of my career's on the line, Puffy.
sorry, not ignorance of the law, ignorance of that I didn't know what he did. Hey, man, can you sign 2 guitar picks? I'm going to a charity auction and I want to give them out. Sure, man. No problem.
He's giving you the story. He's like,
he's
Lester, I made a mistake. I killed a guy. But this officer is going to let me off if you sign 2 guitar picks.
I would love to meet this officer.
Might be a little dirty. There was some bonus content that Stoff isolated for us. First, this was Crosby did answer to Eric Nielsen's comments about his driving. Is that correct, Stoff? I don't think it made it to the podcast, but here's Sidney Crosby on Eric Nielsen's accusations that he was a terrible driver.
I couldn't drive a stick. So like
you couldn't drive, and that's what it was.
So he took me to the parking lot, tried to teach me how to drive a stick, and I couldn't. I almost ruined his car. Okay. So that's why he says I'm a bad driver.
And as it says in the podcast, irony: Crosby can't handle a stick. Hey,
not bad.
That's some good writing there.
There was another story I left out of the book and the podcast. One of the other guys at the party, when Eric was bringing around his icing sugar that he was pretending was cocaine. This is how one of the players, or I don't know if it was one of the players, I shouldn't say that, just one of the people at the party reacted.
You don't have to put this one in the book, but there was actually this big guy, and I was like, hey man, you want a bump? And I was like, before I could do it, he grabbed this $100 bill and did the line of icing sugar. I said, oh shit, this thing's gonna be good. Check please, I better get out of here. He's like, oh, but he was buckled, so he's like, oh yeah man, that's good. And then I said, okay, I gotta get out of
here. Wow.
That would be me, because I've never done cocaine. I will never do cocaine. But if I would like trying to fit in the crowd, do some icing sugar, and be like, "Oh man, I am feeling it." That's crazy.
I don't know if you heard this, but the guy later lost a foot due to diabetes.
We did.
The saying will be, "Hey kids, don't do sugar, do cocaine. It'll save your feet."
We were
the sugar.
That same Acapulco trip with the Clemson story. You have to listen to the Rubber Boots podcast for that, where I told a bunch of guys I went to Clemson. It's a long story, but we were hanging around with a few guys from the States, and we were doing tequila poppers. Do you know what tequila poppers are?
Yes.
Yep.
Basically, a little bit of tequila. You put 7-Up in it. You smack it. It gets fizzy, and you chug it. And this guy was kind of a BSer. And so we started not putting tequila in his, just putting 7-Up in. And we did about 6 of these in a row, and he was like putting on the big show. Oh, man, I can't see anything anymore, man. This is crazy. Because he had 6 shots of 7-Up.
Maybe he was having an allergic reaction.
There's a
citrus.
side note. This is a little bit of TV history, but there's a famous episode of Cheers where they give Cliff Clavin non-alcoholic beer, and he's hammered.
Exactly,
well,
same thing.
My favorite part of that story, James, is you calling the guy lying about that the BSer. While you're telling people you go to Clemson.
You're not wrong about that. One other thing for you. It's time for another ad read, don't you think?
Got to pay the bills.
Sure.
What should one pay for a quality golf net? How do pigeons procreate? Is it acceptable to sing out loud on a plane? These questions have plagued mankind for years. Luckily, one podcast has the answers. The Rubber Boots Podcast, available wherever you find your podcasts. That's about enough. We have to do our actual Rubber Boots podcast now. So I think first installment of Rubber Beauties went really well. I thought you guys were great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm very pleased. I'm assuming I will get some kind of a Canadian Screen Award nomination for this.
Well, James, are you going to do like a book launch, like where you're like go to host a party or something where everyone goes there and gets copies of your books and you mingle and you tell stories? Are you gonna have one of those?
Yeah, I'm gonna have a big one. No masks. Everybody's gonna just lick each other.
A super spreader event.
Yeah, I don't know.
We're gonna have a podcast about that too.
Still trying to figure out how we do book signings and such in the age of COVID, but we will. We'll figure it out. So thank you guys for joining us again. Listen to the all episodes of Beauties wherever you find your fine podcast. Next week, great stories from Jon Cooper and Steven Stamkos. And one more ad before we go. Where did Stoff's car break down? Who did Lester croon last night? What was the amount Puffy's bail was set at? Catch up with the Rubber Boots podcast, available wherever you find your podcasts. See you next time, everybody.
Rubber Beauties, Rubber Beauties, the truth to themselves. Rubber Beauties, Rubber Beauties, the truth. It's true, it's true, it's true. Rubber Beauties, Rubber Beauties, the truth to themselves.
Are you wearing your rubber boots tonight?